A little girl walks down a hallway in Washington, D.C., in the United States. She's 8 years old. She's wearing a purple winter coat and pink boots. She's got a backpack, and she's holding the hand of a man 3 times her age. A man her family calls a friend, a helper, someone who showed up when nobody else did. The camera is a hotel security system. The date stamped in the corner reads February 26, 2014. The man leads her past the front desk, past the elevator, down a corridor lined with identical doors, and into a room. That's the last confirmed sighting of her, for 5 more days. On March 1st, another camera, a different hotel, catches them one final time. She walks in. She does not walk out. Not on camera, not anywhere. Not once, not ever, in the 12 years since. Her name was Relisha Tenau Rudd, and by the time anyone in a position of power noticed she was gone, she had already been missing for a month. This is the story of a homeless shelter, with bed bugs in the walls and a predator on the payroll, of a school that accepted a fake doctor's note without asking a single follow-up question, of a police department that didn't sound a national alert for 18 days, and of a city, the capital of the most powerful nation on earth, that somehow lost an 8-year-old girl in plain sight, then spent a decade arguing about whether it was anyone's fault. 3 questions are going to follow you through this entire video, and I want you to sit with them, because nobody, not the FBI, not the Metropolitan Police Department, not one single investigator in 12 years, has ever been able to answer them with certainty. First, what actually happened inside that hotel room on March 1st, 2014? Second, was Relisha murdered by the man she was last seen with? Or was she sold, handed off, moved somewhere beyond the reach of every search party that ever went looking for her? And third, the one that I think should make every single person watching this uncomfortable. How does a child go missing from a government-run shelter in the nation's capital for 30 straight days without a single adult whose literal job was to protect her raising the alarm? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a system built to protect the most vulnerable child in that shelter became the very thing that let her disappear. Before we talk about how Relisha Rudd disappeared, I need you to know who she was, because in the 12 years since her name entered the national conversation about missing children, it's become far too easy to reduce her to a case file, a statistic, a cold case number in an FBI database. She wasn't that. She was a little girl who, according to the people who knew her, could walk into a room and change its entire temperature. Relisha Tenau Rudd was born on October 29, 2005, in Washington, D.C. By the time she was 8 years old, she had already lived through more instability than most adults experience in a lifetime. Her mother, Shamika Young, struggled with housing insecurity for years, and by early 2014, the family, Relisha, her mother, and her 4 younger siblings, were living at what was, at the time, the largest family homeless shelter in the District of Columbia, the D.C. General Family Shelter. If you've never heard of D.C. General, understand this: it wasn't a shelter in the clean, temporary refuge sense that word implies. It was a decommissioned public hospital, the old D.C. General Hospital complex, repurposed, in a rush, to house hundreds of homeless families after the city's shelter system buckled under demand. At its peak, it held more than 600 people, roughly half of them children. Former residents and advocates described the conditions for years before Relisha ever went missing. Bedbug infestations, broken elevators, inadequate heating, mold, a lack of secure entry points, and, critically, minimal oversight of who was allowed to move freely through the building. It was, in the words of one advocate who later spoke to reporters, no place for a child to grow up. And yet, in 2014, it was home to hundreds of them. One of the organizations trying to make that reality survivable was a nonprofit called the Homeless Children's Playtime Project, a group that ran programs for kids at D.C. General, giving them something resembling a normal childhood inside an institutional building that offered almost nothing else. For about 18 months before she disappeared, Relisha was one of the children that organization served. Think about what that timeline actually means. 18 months of structured programming, of staff members and volunteers checking in on her, playing with her, watching her grow, and it still wasn't enough of a safety net to catch what was happening to her in the final weeks of her life at that shelter. That's not a criticism of the Playtime Project, which by every account did more for these children than the city itself was doing. It's a measure of just how much danger can move undetected through a building that's supposed to be a place of last resort, not a hunting ground. Relisha had 4 younger siblings. She was, by several accounts, something of a second set of hands for her mother in that overcrowded, overwhelmed household, the kind of oldest daughter who grows up a little faster than she should, simply because there are more mouths to feed than there are adults available to feed them. Shamika Young was, by the accounts of people who encountered the family, a mother doing her best inside a system that offered her almost no real support, no stable housing, no reliable childcare, no clear path out of the shelter system, and, as we're about to see, a predator who specifically targeted families in exactly her situation. That's worth sitting with for a second too, because it's central to understanding how any of this was possible. Kahlil Tatum didn't choose a random family to target. He chose one that was exhausted, stretched thin, and desperately grateful for any adult who showed up offering to help. The people who worked with her didn't describe a withdrawn or troubled child. They described a girl who was, in their words, adorable. The kind of kid who lit up a room the second she walked into it. That detail matters. Hold on to it, because it's going to make everything that follows so much harder to sit with. She was 8 years old, 4 feet tall, 70 to 80 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. In the weeks before she vanished, she was known to wear that purple winter coat and a pair of pink boots. Details so specific, so achingly ordinary, that they read less like a police description and more like something a mother would say while packing a school bag. And somewhere inside that shelter, inside a building meant to be a refuge for families who had nowhere else to go, Relisha met the man who would become the last person seen with her alive. His name was Kahlil Malik Tatum. He was 51 years old, and he was the janitor. Here is the detail that should stop you cold, and it's the first of what I'd call the disturbing details in this case, the kind of fact that, once you learn it, makes you question every institution that was supposed to be protecting this child. Kahlil Tatum was a convicted felon, not a minor record, not a decades-old youthful mistake. He had prior convictions for burglary, larceny, and breaking and entering, offenses that speak directly to a pattern of violating spaces that weren't his to enter. He served time in prison from 1993 to 2003. He was released, and then he went back to prison again, from 2004 to 2011. He got out in 2011. And within a few years, he was working inside a homeless shelter with unsupervised access to hundreds of vulnerable families, including their children, as an employee of a private contractor called the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, the organization the city paid to run DC General and, reportedly, several other homeless service programs across Washington. Let that sit for a second. A man with 2 separate felony convictions for illegally entering spaces was hired to hold keys to a building full of homeless children. Nobody flagged it. Nobody stopped it. And by the time anyone thought to ask how it happened, it was far too late to matter. According to later reporting, Tatum wasn't a quiet background employee who kept to himself. He was known, inside that building, among staff and residents, for inappropriately fraternizing with the families who lived there. And more specifically, multiple accounts describe him as someone who paid particular, unusual attention to young girls. That's not a detail investigators pieced together after Relisha vanished. That's a pattern people around him reportedly noticed while it was happening, while he still had access to that building, while he still had access to her. So how does a man like that end up alone with an 8-year-old child, off camera, off the record, for days at a time? The answer is the second disturbing detail in this case, and it's the one that I think is the hardest to hear, because it doesn't involve a stranger dragging a child into a van. It involves trust, deliberately built, over months. Tatum didn't grab Relisha. He groomed his way into her family's life. He befriended Relisha's mother, Shamika Young. He bought Relisha gifts, including a tablet computer, the kind of expensive, exciting present that a family living in a homeless shelter would rarely be able to afford on their own. He took her to see Disney on Ice. He positioned himself, deliberately and patiently, as something between a family friend and a benefactor, the one adult in a hard, unstable situation who seemed to have a little extra to give. And it worked. Because eventually, Shamika Young did something that, with the full weight of hindsight, is almost unbearable to say out loud. She allowed Tatum to take her daughter away overnight. Reportedly, the arrangement was that Relisha would stay with Tatum and his granddaughter, a detail meant to make the whole thing sound safe, domestic, supervised. There was no granddaughter present. There was no safety. There was just a 51-year-old convicted felon and an 8-year-old girl, alone, in hotel rooms, for days that stretched into weeks. I want to pause here and talk directly about grooming, because this case is, unfortunately, a textbook illustration of how it actually works. And understanding the pattern is the entire reason cases like this get told at all. Grooming rarely looks like danger in the moment. It looks like generosity. It looks like the one adult who remembers a kid's favorite snack, who shows up with a gift for no particular reason, who offers to help out a stretched thin parent by taking a child off her hands for an afternoon, then an overnight, then several nights in a row. Each individual step feels small enough to explain away. It's only when you lay the entire pattern out end to end, the gifts, the outings, the overnight stays, the isolation from any other adult who might ask questions, that it becomes unmistakable for what it is. That's exactly the pattern investigators reconstructed with Kahlil Tatum. Not a stranger snatching a child off a playground, a trusted adult, inside a trusted institution, patiently and methodically removing every layer of protection between himself and a child, one small favor at a time, until, by the final weeks of February 2014, nobody around Relisha was asking where she actually was, because everyone believed she was safe with Mr. Tatum. This is the part of the story where I need to be careful with you, and honest with you at the same time. We do not know, with legal certainty, everything that happened to Relisha during the time she spent with Kahlil Tatum. Tatum was never arrested. He was never questioned. He never stood trial. Whatever happened in those hotel rooms went with him. But investigators, people who spent years working this case, who reviewed the surveillance footage, who interviewed everyone who crossed paths with Tatum in his final weeks, have said, on the record, what they believe. A senior law enforcement official told the Washington Post that they suspected Tatum had been sexually exploiting Relisha, and that he may have even been trafficking her out to other people. That same official suggested a chilling possible motive for what happened next in this story. That Tatum's wife may have discovered what he was doing. We'll get to her. But first, we need to talk about how a child can vanish from a shelter for an entire month, 30 days, before a single official body treats it as an emergency. I want to walk you through the timeline here, month by month, because the gap between when Relisha actually disappeared and when anyone with real authority started looking for her is, on its own, one of the most damning parts of this entire case. Late February 2014. Surveillance cameras at a Holiday Inn Express on Bladensburg Road in Northeast Washington capture Relisha and Kahlil Tatum walking together down a hallway. The date on that footage is February 26. This is one of the earliest pieces of hard evidence investigators would later recover, proof that by late February, the two of them were already spending time alone together in hotels, far from the shelter, far from any supervision. Around this same period, Relisha simply stopped showing up to school. Now, in most households, a child missing multiple consecutive days of school triggers automatic red flags, a call home, a truancy officer, an escalating series of check-ins. That safety net exists specifically to catch situations like this one, and on paper, it seemed to work. The school did ask questions. The answer they got was a note. It came from Relisha's grandmother, Melissa Young, and it said the child was having health problems and was under the care of a doctor, Dr. Tatum. Read that again. The doctor's name was Tatum. The school contacted the number they were given for this supposed physician. Nobody thought to verify that Dr. Tatum was, in fact, a licensed medical doctor. Nobody cross-referenced the name. When the school eventually tried to arrange an in-person meeting to discuss Relisha's prolonged absence, Kahlil Tatum, the janitor posing as her doctor, simply didn't show up. That's the moment. That's the exact moment the system should have snapped into gear. Instead, it took weeks more before anyone called the police. I want to break down exactly how many separate people had a chance to stop this, and didn't. Not out of malice, in most cases, but out of the kind of institutional inertia that lets tragedies like this happen. The school had Relisha's attendance record, showing consecutive unexplained absences. The school had a note referencing a doctor whose name was identical to a shelter janitor's surname, a coincidence that, on its own, should have prompted a single phone call to actually verify a medical license. The shelter itself had staff who, by later accounts, were aware Tatum spent an unusual amount of time around young girls, including Relisha specifically, and the broader city bureaucracy, the network of caseworkers, contractors, and city employees who were all, on paper, responsible for the well-being of families at DC General, had, somewhere in its files, the fact that Child Protective Services had prior involvement with this exact household. Every one of those threads existed, separately, in isolation, in different offices, on different desks, in different systems that didn't talk to each other. It took Relisha vanishing entirely, 30 days of silence, before anyone finally pulled those threads together into a single, urgent picture. And by then, the most important window, the one where she might still have been reachable, had almost certainly already closed. By the time a school counselor finally picked up the phone and reported Relisha missing to the Metropolitan Police Department, the date was March 19, 2014. Relisha had not been seen in school, verified alive, in a full month. Think about how much can happen to a person in 30 days. Now understand that for 30 days, an 8-year-old girl from a city-run shelter was unaccounted for, and the machinery that exists specifically to protect children like her simply never activated. March 1, 2014 turned out to be significant for another reason entirely. One investigators wouldn't understand the importance of until much later. Surveillance footage from a Days Inn on New York Avenue in Northeast DC shows Relisha walking with Tatum into a hotel room that day. That footage, time-stamped March 1, 2014, is the last confirmed visual proof, in the entire 12 years since, that Relisha Rudd was alive. Everything that happened after March 1, every theory, every search, every tip that came into the FBI's hotline, happened in the absence of any further confirmed sighting of her. No later camera, no later witness, no later phone call. March 1, a hotel room, and then nothing. Once police did get involved on March 19th, the investigation moved with real urgency. Detectives began pulling surveillance footage from hotels across the district. They started reconstructing Tatum's movements, and what they found, piece by piece, was far darker than a missing child case involving a family friend who'd overstepped his welcome. They found a man who was about to become a murder suspect. On the same day Relisha was officially reported missing, March 19, 2014, police made a discovery in Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside the DC line, that changed the entire nature of this investigation. A woman was found dead in a motel room, shot in the head. Her name was Andrea Tatum, Kahlil Tatum's wife. Surveillance footage from that motel showed the two of them, Kahlil and Andrea, entering the room together the night before her body was found. Whatever happened between them behind that door, only one person walked out of it alive, and it wasn't her. This is where the case stopped being a missing persons investigation with a person of interest, and became a homicide investigation with a fugitive suspect who also happened to be the last known adult with an 8-year-old girl. DC police secured an arrest warrant for Kahlil Tatum in his wife's murder. And then the manhunt began. Investigators traced Tatum's movements in the days after Relisha was last seen, and what they found deepened the horror rather than resolving it. On March 2nd, the day after that final hotel sighting of Relisha, Tatum was recorded on camera buying a shovel, a container of lime, and boxes of 42-gallon trash bags. I'm not going to tell you what investigators believe those purchases meant, because I think you already know. That combination of items has one grim, common use in cases like this, and law enforcement treated it exactly that way, as evidence pointing toward the disposal of a body, not the safekeeping of a missing child. For nearly 2 weeks after that purchase, Kahlil Tatum was a ghost. A wanted man, a murder suspect, the last confirmed adult contact with a missing 8-year-old, and nobody could find him. The FBI joined the search. Police canvassed the district. Search teams combed parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings across Washington, hoping to find either Tatum or Relisha, ideally both, ideally alive. They found one of them. On March 31, 2014, searchers combing through the Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, a quiet, marshy stretch of National Park Service land in northeast Washington, known mostly for its water lily ponds and walking trails, found a body inside a garden shed. It was Kahlil Tatum. Metropolitan Police confirmed the discovery to the public on April 1, 2014. He had died of what investigators determined was an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound, and ballistics testing would later confirm the gun that killed him was the same weapon used to kill his wife, Andrea, 11 days earlier. Relisha was not with him. There was no sign of her anywhere near that shed. No evidence at the scene connecting to her location. Nothing in his final hours. No note, no confession, no map, no clue that told investigators where she was or what had happened to her. The one person who might have been able to answer every question in this case, who actually knew where Relisha Rudd was or what happened to her, was gone. Whatever Kahlil Tatum knew, he took with him into that shed, and he made absolutely certain no one would ever be able to ask him. I want you to sit with how cruel that is, for a moment. For 30 days, systems that should have protected Relisha failed to notice she was gone. For the 11 days after police finally started looking, the one man with real answers stayed a step ahead of them. And in the end, he chose the one exit that guaranteed those answers would never come out in a courtroom, never come out in an interrogation room, never come out at all. Investigators didn't get a confession. They got a body, a gun, and a growing sense of dread about what that silence meant for an 8-year-old girl. The search for Relisha didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. The FBI got directly involved, issuing public appeals and eventually posting a reward of up to $25,000 for information leading to her location and return. A reward that, as of this video, still stands, more than a decade later. Search teams expanded their efforts across the district and into surrounding counties. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children put her case in front of the entire country. And still, nothing. No body. No confirmed sighting. No credible tip that ever led investigators to her. This is where I have to be transparent with you about something important. There is no confirmed, court-proven answer to what happened to Relisha Rudd. There has been no trial, because there was no living defendant to try. Everything from this point forward is theory, informed, investigated, but ultimately unresolved theory. I'm going to walk you through what investigators and reporters have pieced together, and I want you to understand clearly where the evidence ends and speculation begins. Theory 1. Kahlil Tatum killed her. This is, by most accounts, the theory law enforcement considers most likely. It follows the darkest but most internally consistent version of the timeline. Tatum isolated Relisha, allegedly abused her, and, facing the discovery of what he'd done, possibly after his wife found out, killed both his wife and, investigators fear, Relisha herself, before taking his own life. Under this theory, her body may be somewhere investigators have already searched and simply missed, or somewhere they've never thought to look at all. The purchase of the shovel, the lime, and the trash bags on March 2, the day after Relisha's last confirmed sighting, is the single piece of physical evidence that makes this theory the working assumption for many investigators. It's circumstantial, it's not a confession, but it's a chillingly specific shopping list for a man who, at that exact moment, was the last known person with an 8-year-old girl. Theory 2. She was sold or trafficked. Given the concerns that a senior law enforcement official raised, that Tatum may have been sexually exploiting Relisha and potentially pimping her out to others, some have speculated that Relisha wasn't killed by Tatum at all, but rather handed off, sold, or trafficked to someone else, before his own life spiraled into murder and suicide. I want to be precise here, because this is a detail that gets sensationalized a lot online. District of Columbia Metropolitan Police detectives have specifically stated that they ruled out the sex trafficking theory as it relates to Relisha's mother and stepfather selling her. That specific angle, the idea that her own family sold her into trafficking, was investigated and was not supported by what detectives found. That doesn't eliminate every trafficking-adjacent theory connected to Tatum himself, but it's an important distinction, and one that matters both for accuracy and for basic fairness to a family that has already endured unimaginable public scrutiny and suspicion. Theory 3. A third party was involved, possibly connected to Tatum's death. There's a lesser-known thread in this case, involving Tatum's brother-in-law, a man named Ricky Sheridan Lyles Sr. Some theories raise the possibility that Lyles might have had some involvement, potentially even in Tatum's death itself, suggesting Tatum may not have acted entirely alone, or that someone else played a role in how his story ended. Lyles was questioned by investigators. He was ultimately ruled out as a person of interest, but his name persists in discussions of the case as one of the loose threads that was never fully, publicly resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Theory 4. She's alive. And then there's the theory that refuses to die, championed for years by people closest to Relisha, including her stepfather and other relatives, who have said publicly, even a decade on, that they believe she could still be out there. Their reasoning is simple and, honestly, hard to argue with on pure logic. Her body has never been found. No forensic evidence has ever surfaced confirming her death. In the absence of a body, there is, technically, an absence of proof. It's the theory that keeps this case classified as a missing persons investigation rather than a homicide. And it's the theory that keeps that FBI reward active, keeps the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children updating her age progression photos year after year, and keeps a community in Washington, D.C. lighting candles on October 29th every single year, the date that should be her birthday. It's worth noting how rare a case like this actually is, statistically speaking. Most missing child cases resolve, one way or another, within days or weeks. The ones that stretch into years, without any confirmed sighting, any recovered remains, or any credible break in the case, are a small, painful minority. Relisha's case sits in that minority for a specific, unusual reason. The one person best positioned to explain what happened died by his own hand before investigators ever got the chance to ask him a single question. In most missing persons cases that eventually get solved, the break comes from exactly that kind of interrogation. A suspect who eventually talks, cracks under pressure, or makes a mistake that leads investigators to the truth. Kahlil Tatum removed that possibility entirely, on his own terms, in a park shed, with the same gun he'd already used once. That's part of why this case continues to generate genuine debate among people who've followed it closely for over a decade. True crime researchers, journalists, and advocates alike. Without a surviving suspect, without a body, and without a confession, every theory remains technically alive. That's not a comforting kind of uncertainty. It's the kind that keeps a case open in the FBI's files for over a decade and keeps a family unable to fully grieve, because grieving requires knowing, and nobody in this case has ever been given that. Relisha would have turned 20 years old this past October. Somewhere, in the version of this story where she's alive, she's an adult now. She's had 18th and 19th and 20th birthdays that nobody who loves her has been able to celebrate with her. Before we move on, I want to know what you think. Out of the 4 theories we just walked through, Tatum killed her, she was trafficked or sold to someone else, a third party was involved in how this ended, or she's alive somewhere right now. Which one do you find most convincing, based on the evidence we actually have? Type your theory in the comments below. I genuinely read through these, and on past cases, viewers have pointed out connections and local details that even the official reporting missed. Now, back to the part of this story that Washington, D.C. still hasn't fully reckoned with. I promised you at the start of this video that we'd talk about systemic failure, and I think it's time we actually sat with that, because Relisha's case isn't just a missing persons mystery. It's a case study in exactly how many separate institutions can each fail a single child, one after another, without any one of them ever fully being held accountable. Start with the shelter itself. DC General was, by the accounts of the people who lived and worked there, never a safe place to raise a family. Advocates had been raising alarms about conditions, The bedbugs, the disrepair, the lack of security, for years before Relisha ever went missing. It took her disappearance, and the national attention that followed, to finally accelerate the conversation that eventually led the city to shut the shelter down in 2018, 4 years after Relisha vanished from inside its walls. Then there's the hiring practice that put Kahlil Tatum, a twice-convicted felon with a documented pattern of illegally entering spaces, into a paid position with virtually unsupervised access to hundreds of homeless children. Nobody has ever fully answered, on the public record, exactly how that vetting process worked, or why it failed so completely. Then there's Child Protective Services. Reporting on this case has confirmed that CPS had prior involvement with Relisha's family before she disappeared, meaning the system meant to be watching most closely was already aware this was a household that might need extra attention, and still, no intervention came in time. Then there's the school. A note claiming a child is under the care of a Dr. Tatum should have taken about 90 seconds to disprove. It didn't happen, not because the information was hidden, but because nobody asked the obvious next question. And then there's the Metropolitan Police Department itself, and the 18 days, by some counts closer to a full month, between when Relisha effectively vanished from public life and when a missing persons investigation officially began. No Amber Alert went out during that window. Officials later defended the department's handling of the case once it was underway, and to be fair to them, once MPD did engage, the investigation moved fast, pulling hotel surveillance, identifying Tatum, connecting his wife's murder, mounting a manhunt, all within about 2 weeks. That part of the response is hard to fault. But the part before that, the 30 days of silence, the note about a doctor who didn't exist, the systems that simply didn't talk to each other, that's the part of this story that Washington, D.C. has spent more than a decade trying to reckon with. Some progress has come out of it. Advocates who work directly with Relisha have pointed out real, tangible changes. Shelters across the district are now mandated to count every child in their beds every single night, a policy that sounds almost unbelievably basic, until you remember it didn't exist in a way that caught Relisha's absence in 2014. Interagency communication between schools, shelters, and law enforcement has, by most accounts, tightened since. But here's the question that community members still ask, more than a decade later, and it's a question this channel wants to leave with you too. How much of that attention, the reforms, the national coverage, the FBI reward, the age progression photos, would have existed at all if Relisha Rudd had been a different kind of 8-year-old, a wealthier one, a whiter one, a girl from a stable, 2-parent home in a well-off DC suburb, instead of a room in a condemned former hospital, repurposed as a homeless shelter? Reporting at the time, and in years since, has pointed to something uncomfortable. Relisha's case received comparatively limited coverage outside the Washington, D.C. area in its earliest weeks, a pattern that researchers and advocates have connected to a broader, well-documented trend in how missing children of color, particularly black girls from low-income families, are covered compared to their white, middle-class counterparts. It's a pattern that has a name in academic and advocacy circles, sometimes called missing white woman syndrome, and Relisha's case has repeatedly been cited as one of its clearest, most painful examples. That's exactly why this channel exists. Because cases like Relisha's don't get the sustained, serialized, national attention that a lot of other missing persons cases receive by default. And we think that's backwards. Her case deserves the same scrutiny, the same persistence, the same refusal to let it fade, that any other missing child in America would get, maybe more. Every year, on October 29th, the day that should be just an ordinary birthday, people in Washington, D.C. gather to light candles for Relisha. Community members, advocates from the Homeless Children's Playtime Project, the organization that knew her before any of this happened, family, strangers who've simply never been able to let her case go cold in their own minds, even if the calendar keeps moving forward without her. One advocate who worked with Relisha put it about as plainly as anyone has, in comments made years after her disappearance. She said she couldn't imagine anything sadder than being missing and having people simply stop looking for you, or worse, quietly start assuming you're dead. She said she owed it to Relisha to keep that candle lit, in the hope that if she's out there somewhere, she's safe, and that she'll find her way home one day. Relisha's family has carried a similar, complicated hope for over a decade. Her stepfather has spoken publicly, even a decade after her disappearance, about holding on to the belief that she could still be alive. It's the kind of hope that's almost impossible for an outsider to fully understand. The ability to keep believing, year after year, birthday after birthday, without a single new piece of hard evidence to justify it. But that's what love does in the absence of an ending. It refuses to accept the version of the story with no hope left in it. The FBI's case file remains open. It lists her as missing, not deceased. Her description hasn't changed in the file, even though everyone involved understands that the 8-year-old girl in that purple coat and pink boots would be a young woman today, 20 years old, an adult, someone who, in the version of events her family still holds on to, has an entire life happening somewhere that none of them have been able to reach. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children periodically releases updated age progression images, using forensic software to estimate what Relisha might look like now, at each new age, 12, then 14, then 16, and beyond. It's one of the more quietly devastating tools in a case like this, a technology built entirely around hope, generating a face that has to stand in for a real one that nobody's seen in over a decade. Local advocates have said it plainly, and it's stuck with a lot of people who followed this case. They believe the city is always just one traffic stop away from solving Relisha Rudd's case. One routine encounter, one tip that finally connects to the right person, one database match on a jaywalking stop, a traffic violation, a welfare check somewhere none of us would expect. That's the strange, aching nature of a case like this. It's not a cold trail in the sense of having run completely dry. It's a case that could, theoretically, be solved by an entirely mundane, unremarkable moment if the right officer runs the right name on the right day. As of this video, Relisha Tenau Rudd remains missing. 12 years. The FBI's reward, up to $25,000 for information leading to her location and return, remains active, and their tip line remains open. The Metropolitan Police Department's investigation, while not moving with the daily urgency of those first frantic weeks in March 2014, has never officially closed. There is no confirmed grave, no trial transcript, no definitive answer, just an open file, an unresolved reward, and a community that, more than a decade later, still refuses to let her name fade out of the conversation. Kahlil Tatum died without ever facing a courtroom for anything he may have done to Relisha, or to his wife, Andrea. Whatever specific knowledge he carried about the final days of Relisha's life went into that shed at Kenilworth Park with him, and it has never come back out. And so the case remains exactly what it was on April 1st, 2014, the day his body was found. A missing 8-year-old girl, one confirmed set of hotel surveillance footage as the last proof she was alive, and a list of theories that all lead to the same unbearable place. We don't know. I want to end this the same way I started it, with that hallway. That grainy, ordinary hotel hallway, captured by a camera that was never meant to matter to anyone, on a day that seemed, to whoever was watching that monitor in real time, like absolutely nothing at all. A little girl in a purple coat, walking beside a man she'd been taught, patiently and deliberately, to trust. Somewhere out there, in an evidence room, or in a family's memory, or maybe, if the people who still hold on to hope are right, in the mind of a young woman living an entirely different life under an entirely different name, the rest of that story exists. We just don't have access to it. Not yet. Relisha Rudd should be 20 years old right now. She should have graduated high school. She might have gone to college, started a career, fallen in love, built a life entirely her own, 3,000 miles or 3 blocks from where this story began. Instead, her name lives in an FBI file, in a decade of candlelight vigils, and now, in this video. That's really the only thing any of us can actually do for her. 12 years on. Keep saying her name. Keep her case in front of people. Make sure that somewhere, someone who knows something, someone who's been carrying a piece of this story in silence for over a decade, sees this video, and finally decides the silence isn't worth protecting anymore. If you have any information about Relisha Rudd's disappearance, you're urged to contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip directly through tips.fbi.gov. You do not have to identify yourself. The reward for information leading to her location and safe return stands at up to $25,000. Before you go, I want to ask you something, because I think it matters more than any subscribe button ever could. Knowing everything you just learned about the 30 days of silence before anyone officially looked for Relisha, the fake doctor's note, the missed school flags, the janitor with 2 felony convictions who somehow still held keys to a building full of children. Where do you think the system failed her the hardest? Was it the shelter that hired Tatum in the first place? The school that never verified that note? Or the 30 days where every single institution that was supposed to be watching simply wasn't? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And honestly, some of the most important context on cases like this has come directly from people in the comments section who either lived through similar systems or know this community firsthand. If this is the kind of story you want more of, cases involving Black children and Black families that the national media consistently undercovers, told with the depth and respect they deserve, this channel, AMC True Crime, exists specifically for that. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because the moment any real development breaks in this case, any arrest, any tip that goes anywhere, any update from the FBI, you'll be the first to know, and we'll be the first channel to bring it to you. Relisha Tenau Rudd. Say her name. Keep looking.